What if the operating system millions of people trust to just work quietly in the background is going through the biggest identity crisis it has had in over a decade, and almost nobody outside a small circle of developers is talking about it? Right now, in 2026, 3 separate storms are hitting the Linux world at the exact same time. KDE, one of the most believable desktop teams in open source, is quietly building something that could replace the very idea of a Linux distro as you know it. At the same time, the Linux kernel itself is in the middle of what insiders are openly calling a civil war. And buried underneath all of that noise, a Linux distribution just accused one of its own former developers of deliberately sabotaging years of work out of sheer spite. This is not a slow news week for Linux. This might be one of the most consequential stretches in its entire history. Before you go any further, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, but it tells me you actually want to understand what is happening to the operating system, running your Android phone, your Steam Deck, most of the servers, on the internet, and possibly the very laptop you are watching this on. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do it. Because what is unfolding right now inside KDE and inside the Linux kernel is going to shape what your desktop looks like for years to come. And you are going to want to see exactly how this develops. Let's start with the headline that is quietly rewriting what installing Linux even means. For over 3 decades, using Linux on a desktop has basically meant picking a distribution, something like Ubuntu, Fedora, or Arch, and trusting that whoever built it made good decisions for you. KDE, the team behind one of the most polished desktop environments in the entire Linux world, decided that was not good enough anymore, so they built their own operating system from scratch. It is called, quite simply, KDE Linux. And as of the middle of 2026, multiple outlets in the Linux press are calling this the actual year of the KDE Linux desktop. Not a joke. Not an old meme about the year of the Linux desktop finally coming true. A genuine shift being tracked in real time by people who follow this space professionally. Here is why that matters. KDE Linux is not just another distro added to the pile of hundreds already out there. It is built as what developers call an immutable base operating system, using Arch Linux packages under the hood, but deliberately built to not be considered Arch-based in the traditional sense. The core system folder, the part of your OS that normally gets messy and unstable over years of updates, is read-only. Updates are delivered as complete images, atomically, the same way your phone updates rather, than the old messy Linux way of 1,000 separate package updates that can conflict with each other. If something breaks, you roll back instantly using built-in Btrfs snapshots. This is not a small tweak. This is KDE fundamentally rethinking what a desktop operating system should feel like in 2026, and doing it in a way that borrows the best ideas from Silverblue, Chrome OS, and Mac OS, while keeping the deep customization Linux users have always loved. And here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If the team behind one of the most respected desktop environments in Linux history is willing to throw out the traditional distro model entirely and start over, what does that tell you about how confident they are that the old way of doing Linux is no longer good enough for where computing is heading? But building a brand new operating system from the ground up is never a clean, drama-free process. And KDE Linux has already had its share of very real growing pains. Just this past March 2026, the KDE Linux development team publicly documented a genuinely alarming bug. A newly released version of Systemed, the core system manager most modern Linux distributions depend on, had a serious flaw. It caused KDE Linux's update process to silently fail at exactly the wrong step, tricking the system into trying to boot an operating system image that no longer actually existed. And here's the part that should make you pause. Because of a second bug in how KDE Linux handles its critical system folder, attempting to roll back from that broken state could actually erase much of the content that made the rollback possible in the first place. In plain English, a bug meant to keep you safe from disaster nearly became the disaster itself. Thankfully, KDE Linux still had built-in Btrfs snapshots as a last line of defense, and the team published clear recovery steps almost immediately. But that single incident tells you everything about where KDE Linux currently sits. It is still labeled alpha quality software, built by developers actively encouraging only genuinely brave testers to install it on anything they care about. This is bleeding edge, experimental, occasionally terrifying territory. And yet, despite that, the momentum behind it right now is real, and it is growing fast. So the real question becomes this: is KDE Linux about to become the definitive way people experience Linux on the desktop going forward? Or is it still just an ambitious science project that happens to be getting a lot of attention at exactly the right moment? That is exactly what we are going to dig into next, along with a genuinely ugly civil war currently tearing through the Linux kernel's own development community, a conflict serious enough that even Linus, Torvalds himself, has been forced to step directly into the middle of it. Stay with me, because this next part gets a lot more heated. So let's get into it, because if you think normal companies have office politics, wait until you see what has been happening inside the actual development process of the Linux kernel itself throughout 2026. This is the software running an estimated majority of the entire internet. And right now, behind the scenes, it looks less like a calm engineering project and more like what one tech writer this June literally described as a messy public divorce. Here's the core of it. For over 3 decades, the Linux kernel was written almost entirely in one programming language, C. It is fast, it is battle-tested, and generations of kernel developers have built their entire careers mastering its quirks. But a few years ago, a new effort began pushing to bring the Rust programming language into the kernel, specifically because Rust offers built-in memory safety features that make entire categories of dangerous security bugs essentially impossible to write by accident. To a new generation of developers, this was not optional. It was overdue. To a large portion of the old guard C maintainers, it was an unwelcome complication being forced onto a code base they had spent decades perfecting. That tension boiled over into something the tech press has openly called a Linux civil war, and it escalated all the way up to Linus Torvalds himself. When a prominent kernel developer publicly clashed with a maintainer over a Rust driver patch getting rejected and pushed for public pressure campaigns on social media to force the issue, Torvalds did not side with him. Instead, Torvalds fired back directly, telling him bluntly, quote, "How about you accept the fact that maybe the problem is you," unquote, and stating flatly that the current review process works, has problems, but that, quote, "there is no perfect," unquote. He went further, saying the social media brigading approach made him not want anything to do with that developer's method at all. Now here's a question worth sitting with. When the single most powerful person in the entire Linux kernel project publicly tells one of his own developers that the problem might be him personally, and that comment gets picked up by tech outlets around the world, what does that actually do to trust inside a community that depends entirely on thousands of volunteers cooperating peacefully? Does it settle the argument, or does it just confirm to one side that leadership has quietly picked a favorite? Because that is genuinely how a lot of C developers reacted. Reporting from mid-2026 describes top maintainers quitting the project entirely over the Rust integration fight, describing an atmosphere that had become, in their words, toxic. And this is not some fringe internet drama happening in a random Discord server. This is happening inside the mailing lists that literally decide what code ships to billions of devices worldwide, from your Android phone to satellites currently orbiting the planet right now. And just when you think that is dramatic enough on its own, a second completely different fight erupted at almost exactly the same time. Artificial intelligence. Throughout May and June of 2026, Torvalds used his own weekly kernel update posts, the same posts he uses to announce new release candidates, to voice growing frustration about AI tools flooding the development process. In one post, he stated plainly that, quote, "The continued flood of AI reports has basically made the security list almost entirely unmanageable," unquote, describing enormous duplication because multiple researchers were running the exact same AI tools and independently reporting the exact same bugs, burying human maintainers in repetitive noise. The very next week, he was frustrated again, this time about a release candidate for Linux kernel version 7.1, ballooning in size because of what he called, quote, "totally trivial stuff," unquote, much of it triggered by AI code review tools, flagging things that genuinely did not need fixing at that late stage of development. This eventually forced the Linux kernel community to sit down in early 2026 and formally decide on an actual policy. Can developers submit AI-generated code or not? The answer that came out of months of fierce internal debate was refreshingly blunt. Yes, you are allowed to use AI tools like Copilot or large language models to help write kernel code. But if that code turns out to be broken, insecure, or what developers have started calling AI slop, the human being who clicked submit is personally on the hook for it, no exceptions, and no hiding behind the tool. And here's the part that shows exactly why that rule exists. Reports from earlier this year describe an incident where a kernel maintainer at a major chip company submitted a patch that was completely generated by AI, without disclosing that fact. Code that technically ran, but quietly introduced a performance regression that ended up misleading other maintainers during review. Even Torvalds later acknowledged that without an honest AI disclosure label, that code simply did not get the scrutiny it actually needed. The lesson the entire community seems to be landing on is not that AI itself is the enemy, it is that pretending you wrote something yourself when you did not is what genuinely damages trust inside a project this important. If all of this is making you rethink how stable you assume the foundation of Linux actually is right now, drop a comment and tell me honestly, do you think AI belongs anywhere near kernel development at all? Or is this exactly the kind of shortcut that eventually causes a serious security disaster down the line? I read every single comment personally, and this conversation genuinely is the best part of putting a story like this together. Because here's the thing. This Rust versus C tension and this AI code drama were not even the only trust crisis rocking the wider Linux world in 2026. Just this month, on July 9th, an entirely different Linux distribution found itself in the middle of a genuinely shocking act of alleged sabotage, one that shows exactly how much damage a single person with the wrong access can do to years of collective work in a matter of hours. And that story connects directly to the bigger question hanging over this entire video. Stick around, because what happens next explains why so many people inside this community are starting to ask whether Linux's traditional trust-based structure can even survive its own explosive growth. Let's talk about what happened on July 9th, 2026, because this story is the kind of thing that sounds almost too dramatic to be real, and yet it is fully documented, publicly confirmed, and honestly one of the clearest examples yet of just how fragile open source trust can be when it finally snaps. The distribution involved is OpenMandriva, one of the spiritual successors to the legendary Mandrake Linux many longtime Linux users grew up with. According to OpenMandriva's own public statement, a developer named Btrfs, known in open source circles for his work on the popular Mumble Voice chat project, had joined the team some time ago and eventually offered to help migrate several dozen of the project's repositories away from GitHub and onto his own privately operated server. Some maintainers were uneasy about handing that much infrastructure control to a single individual, but the move went ahead anyway, because that is often simply how trust works inside volunteer-driven open source projects. You extend it because the alternative is that nothing ever gets built at all. Then things started to unravel. OpenMandriva says trouble began after two other contributors joined the project alongside Btrfs, with one of them allegedly engaging in repeated abusive behavior toward users and fellow team members, much of it happening quietly in private messages where nobody else could see it. Several contributors reportedly left the project entirely before maintainers finally stepped in and removed that individual from the team's private chat. He was not formally banned from the wider project, but according to OpenMandriva, that single decision triggered what they described as a cascade of events. Btrfs and another contributor resigned in response, and when OpenMandriva later decided it no longer made sense to keep mirroring its repositories onto Btrfs' private server, and began quietly disconnecting that link. The project says that decision did not go over well at all. Here's the moment where this stops being an ordinary community dispute and becomes something much more serious. OpenMandriva's official statement says that in the early hours of that same week, Btrfs, quote, abusing of the administrative privileges he still had, sabotaged the distribution, unquote. According to the project, he deleted portions of OpenMandriva's GitHub. Repository work material, the project says, had been carefully maintained for years, and it did not stop there. An empty, broken package was reportedly published directly into Cooker, OpenMandriva's rolling development branch, silently replacing every single GNOME and Cosmic Desktop package in that repository. For any user running that bleeding edge branch and choosing to update their desktop environment at exactly the wrong moment, this had the potential to genuinely break their entire desktop session. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If one disgruntled person, holding onto access nobody remembered to fully revoke, can quietly erase years of collaborative work and threaten to break real users' desktops in a matter of hours, how many other open source projects out there right now have that exact same vulnerability? Sitting quietly in their infrastructure, just waiting for the wrong disagreement to happen at the wrong time? OpenMandriva has since said it is restoring every deleted repository and repairing the broken packages, and that a full internal security audit turned up no other violations beyond what was already reported. The project openly stated it considered legal action, going so far as to call the incident a criminal offense, but ultimately chose not to pursue it. For his part, according to reporting from the Lunduk Journal, Btrfs pushed back on the sabotage framing entirely, reportedly saying his objective, quote, was not to harm the distribution I cared for, unquote. Whatever the full truth turns out to be once more details emerge, one thing is already undeniable. This incident is now sitting right alongside the Rusty. Versus C-Fight and the AI code controversy as yet another crack in the same wall, Another moment where the entire open source model, built almost entirely on personal trust between volunteers, showed exactly how much damage that trust can cause when it finally breaks down. And that brings us to something genuinely important to understand about all three of these stories together. KDE quietly building an entirely new operating system from scratch. The kernel community fighting bitterly over Rust, over AI, over who gets the final say on what code actually ships. And now an entire distribution's infrastructure getting torched from the inside by someone who used to be one of its own trusted contributors. These are not three unrelated headlines that happen to be trending in the same month by coincidence. They are three symptoms of the exact same underlying pressure. Linux, as an ecosystem, has grown so large, so fast, and become so genuinely important to how the modern world runs that the old informal handshake-based way of managing trust between developers is visibly starting to strain under its own weight. In real time. Before we get to the actual good news in all of this, because there absolutely is some, I want you to do one small thing for me. If you have been using Linux for years, or if you are brand new and just now discovering how much genuine human drama sits underneath the operating system, running your phone right now, drop a comment and tell me which of these three stories surprised you the most. I read these personally, and I promise you, the comment section on a story like this one is always more interesting than the video itself. Because here's where we go next. Despite absolutely everything you just heard, 2026 is also shaping up to be one of the single strongest years for actual Linux desktop improvements in a very long time. New kernel releases, major new features landing in KDE Plasma, and real measurable growth in how many people are actually choosing Linux on their desktop computers. So let's get into the actual huge updates that make all of this drama genuinely worth paying attention to, because the payoff here is real. So let's end on the part of this story that should genuinely make you excited, because underneath all that drama, 2026 has quietly become one of the most productive years the Linux desktop has ever had. And the numbers actually back that up. Start with the desktop itself. In 2025, Linux officially crossed a milestone that felt almost impossible for decades, surpassing 5% of the US desktop market share, with Windows continuing to lose ground month after month. That is not year of the Linux desktop as an old internet joke anymore. That is real, measurable movement, and 2026 has only accelerated it, largely thanks to KDE Plasma showing up in more places than ever before, from gaming handhelds to immutable distros to full OEM systems shipping straight from manufacturers. And KDE has not been sitting still on the software side either. Plasma 6.6 landed earlier this year and brought genuinely significant upgrades. The biggest headline was a brand new Plasma Login Manager built as a potential eventual replacement for the aging simple desktop display manager that most distros have relied on for years. The Spectacle screenshot tool gained built-in OCR, meaning you can now literally screenshot text and have your system read it back to you as editable text. A new USB portal lets sandboxed apps safely request device access without compromising security. And for anyone running the newer Linux kernel 6.19 series, Plasma 6.6, even added the ability to manually adjust visual sharpness across your entire desktop, something previously reserved for high-end proprietary systems. On top of that, KDE, KDE's window manager, picked up her pixel color pipeline support and smoother animation handling by leaning more heavily on Wayland's presentation time protocol, which, in plain English, just means your desktop should feel noticeably smoother on modern high refresh rate monitors. Then, on June 16th, 2026, Plasma 6.7 shipped, continuing that momentum with more performance work and deeper UI polish, alongside a genuinely fun surprise for longtime KDE users. The beloved AirVisual theme from the KDE 4 era is officially making a comeback, with the classic Oxygen icon set getting a full modern revamp for the current Plasma series. If you have been using KDE for over a decade, that is the kind of detail that hits with real nostalgia. But the biggest engine underneath all of this is the Linux kernel itself, and this year has been an unusually big one there too. On June 14th, 2026, Linus Torvalds officially released Linux kernel 7.1, capping off a cycle that saw nearly 13,000 individual changes contributed by more than 2,000 developers, over 300 of whom were contributing to the kernel for the very first time. Kernel 7.1 shipped with a genuinely major upgrade, a completely rewritten NTFS driver, the result of 4 full years of development work, finally giving Linux users full, reliable write support for Windows-formatted drives without relying on older workarounds. Intel users running the newest Panther Lake processors benefit from Fred, Intel's flexible return and event delivery system, now enabled by default, reducing overhead and tightening security around how the CPU handles interrupts. ARM users got faster Futex operations. Btrfs graduated its shutdown feature out of testing. And in a genuinely satisfying bit of housekeeping, the kernel team stripped out more than 140,000 lines of obsolete code, including support for the ancient Intel 486 processor, hardware nobody has run in production for decades, and the momentum has not slowed down even slightly since then. Just weeks later, on June 28, 2026, the first release candidate for kernel 7.2 landed, and the numbers here are honestly staggering. The Linux kernel source tree has now officially surpassed 43 million lines of code, with contributions from over 200 subsystem maintainers in this cycle alone. A long-standing PCIe bug that had been quietly causing headaches since 2023 finally got fixed. Rust integration continued expanding under Miguel Ojeda's team, despite everything you just heard about the tension surrounding it. And expect kernel 7.2 to reach a full stable release, sometime around mid to late August 2026. So if you are running a rolling release distro like Arch or CachyOS, you will likely see it land on your system not long after that. So here is where that leaves us, and here's the real question underneath everything we just walked through together. KDE is not just maintaining its desktop anymore, it is quietly building the operating system underneath it too, even while working through genuine early stage bugs in public. The Linux kernel is bigger, faster, and more capable than it has ever been, even while its own developers are fighting bitterly over language choice, AI ethics, and who gets final authority over the code running a meaningful chunk of the internet. And the wider open source community just watched in real time exactly how much damage one broken relationship can cause when trust finally runs out. Is this the sound of an ecosystem tearing itself apart? Or is this simply what genuine high-stakes growth actually looks like from the inside, messy, loud, and occasionally uncomfortable, but ultimately moving forward anyway? I would genuinely love to know what you think, so drop that comment below and tell me honestly, does all of this make you more excited to try Linux in 2026, or more hesitant? If this video helped you actually understand what is happening underneath the surface of Linux right now, hit that like button, make sure you are subscribed, and send this to that one friend who keeps saying they are thinking about switching to Linux this year. Based on everything we just covered together, 2026 might genuinely be the most important year this operating system has had in a very long time, and this story is nowhere close to being finished.